Good evening. I'm Jim Gierach, and welcome to Chicago's War on Drugs. This is the 11th edition of our show, and today is Tuesday, June 13th, 2017. For 13 weeks, we are bringing, courtesy of Azteca Baseball, a show called Chicago's War on Drugs that discusses basically which is worse, drugs or the war on drugs. And I have a wonderful guest here I'm going to introduce to you in just a moment, but the reason that we can come here to you is because of Azteca Baseball League, a non-profit organization that has seen fit to help us bring this issue and message to Chicagoland. So now we're just coming off of another weekend, and each Tuesday it seems I have bad news to report. And this weekend was no different. Here in Chicago, we had 43 people shot. 6 of them were fatalities on the warmest weekend to come that we've had thus far. And we need to do something different with Chicago's drug policy, which is Chicago's war on drugs. And here tonight to discuss these matters, I have Jesus Garcia, who is a Cook County Board Commissioner from the 7th District. He's also the floor leader of the commission, and he's a former senator, served from 1993 to 1999, the 1st District here in Chicago. And he was a Chicago alderman also for quite a stint from the 22nd Ward. Jesus, it's a pleasure to have you with me.
Great to be here tonight, Jim.
Well, thank you. Well, the subject is the war on drugs, and you know, when you see stories like the Chicago Tribune article that we just saw, it makes you wonder. You know, are we better off or are we worse off because of this war on drugs?
Well, we've had several decades to assess what the war on drugs has done, and in my opinion, it's been a failure. It's been ineffective in that there's no data that shows that drug use has been decreased as a result of decades of the war on drugs. The results, one of the key results of the war on drugs is that it tends to have a disproportionate impact on people of color in terms of who is prosecuted and who is jailed. Stark statistics show that, for example, Latino teenagers who are arrested for drugs have 3.5 times greater probability of getting arrested and 5 times greater likelihood of being jailed. With black youth, it's 5 times more likely to be arrested and 10 times more likely to be jailed. So another indictment against the war on drugs. And then it's very costly. We spend about $20 billion a year in the war on drugs in the U.S., mostly for enforcement and incarceration, which only feeds the violence that we see in streets in Chicago, because a lot of the violence is rooted in the economy and the illicit economy, where people in poor areas are trying to make money. It helps organize young people and others into gangs whose main mission in life is to sell drugs, and they get into turf battles, and thus we see the endless violence in many parts of the city of Chicago.
Mm-hmm. And it always seems so unfair to minorities and to poor people who suffer the brunt of this war on drugs. And I think the people of Chicago can see that when they see who's disproportionately going to jail, who's being disproportionately arrested.
500,000 people are in jail because of drug charges where there no prior history of violence, and we arrest 700,000 people annually in this country, and yes, they're mostly poor people who can't afford a lawyer.
You know, I think callers are going to be interrupting us, which we welcome calls. This is a call-in show. Caller, what's on your mind?
Hi, Commissioner. What I was going to say is thank you for everything you're doing in the county. We appreciate everything there.
Thank you.
Now, when you become mayor of the city of Chicago, you're going to beat them up or what? I know you're tough
Well,
on drugs and other politicians too.
yeah, we're tonight we're talking about the war on drugs and not political wars that may be coming up in the future of the city of Chicago. But thank you for your call. This is a very serious topic, as you know. But stay tuned to more announcements about, I think, positive political changes that will be coming down the pike. We just celebrated this weekend in Chicago. We hosted the People's Summit. It brought together over 4,000 activists from all over the country. Many people live streamed it. Bernie Sanders gave a wonderful speech on Saturday night. So the air is full of promise. He's become the most prominent politician in the country. I'm very privileged to have struck up a great relationship with him, and that he endorsed me when I ran 2 years ago.
Yes. Well, thank you, caller. But the idea that we need to put politics into the war on drugs and the war on drugs into politics, I think, is so important. We have many problems here in Chicago that I really think are aggravated by the war on drugs. And yet you've served in the legislature, you've served in the city council, you've served on the county board, and yet there's an edict from on high from the federal government coming out of Washington, D.C. that declares we're going to have a war on drugs in Chicago, like it or not. Also in Cleveland, Pittsburgh, Los Angeles, Austin, Texas, and wherever you live, you have a war on drugs and a Controlled Substances Act. What do you think of that?
Well, it's a terrible policy. It's non-commonsensical. Fortunately, we have a point of reference, which is a series of states, I believe 8 of them already, that have either decriminalized or legalized medical marijuana, and the marijuana that is now legal in those states. They're showing us that if you regulate, you create a market for it, you can tax it, there's a social benefit. We're talking about marijuana being available to adults in a controlled, regulated setting, which is much more rational than the madness we've come to experience in city after city and actually all over the country.
And the cartels are suffering with monetary loss, just as the gangs in Chicago would suffer if we would take away the profit which drives this crazy war on drugs. The irony is the good guys and the bad guys are both on the same side of the fight. Police are in favor generally of the war on drugs because they get half the money that gets seized, half the property, the real estate, the airplanes, the jewelry. Half goes to the feds, half goes locally. And the drug cartels and the gangs, just like Al Capone, are in favor of prohibition. Why should they be on the same side?
It's a race to the bottom, and it doesn't make any sense. And our war on drugs has been imposed on our neighbor to the south in Mexico, and it's created havoc there. 150,000 lives have been lost. 28,000 people have been disappeared. These are students, these are journalists, these are working men and women, many of them innocent bystanders, just were in the wrong place at the wrong time.
It's over 10,000 a year, I believe, in Mexico
Yes.
that are being killed. And then in
Yes.
Central America, Honduras,
The second
Guatemala.
most violent country in the world because of the war on drugs. And both Democrats and Republicans are responsible for this policy.
Sure.
It began under Clinton, it continued under Bush in the Merida initiative, and it's continued to the present day. And I don't think that there's going to be a policy change under this administration so far. There's no reason to think that.
I have invited, and the invitation remains open, for our 2 United States senators and for the mayor of the city of Chicago to come on this program and discuss what they feel about the war on drugs. Is it helpful or harmful? I see we had another caller. Do we still have a caller there? Caller?
Oh, hello.
Speak up, please. Your question or comment?
Yes, it's a comment. I just wanted to agree with the commissioner and you guys are saying about far as the war on drugs. But far as what I see, I mean, we're not really winning the battle because, like you said, it's not any jobs in the black, brown communities, period. Then they filtrate our communities with drugs. What they're going to do? They're going to pick up the drugs to sell, to try to do what they got to do. And then after that, what they do to get incarcerated. And that's how they make money. It's all a game. You know, the politicians, some of these politicians, other people backing that, they know what they're actually doing. You know, you got to find jobs in the community because other than that, it's the same cycle will happen over and over again. Thank you.
Thank you, caller. What do you say, Jesus?
University of Illinois, Great Cities Program Initiative just released a study that shows the impact of poverty and disinvestment in certain parts of Cook County, on the west side of the city of Chicago, on the south side, and in parts of western Cook County, suburban Cook County, and the south side, where large numbers of young people are either out of work and out of school. These are individuals that are ripe for finding other means for, subsistence, for earning some money, and illicit drugs and the sale and the creation of those markets is where many of them wind up going, because we're not investing in bringing jobs to those communities. We're not investing in bringing economic development activity to those communities. That's really what has to happen at the root level across the city of Chicago if we're to succeed in eradicating the despair that we read about day in, day out, especially when the weather gets warmer.
You know, the employer of last resort in Chicago and across the nation is the drug business. When someone gets out of jail because they've been convicted, even of a nonviolent offense, and they have a drug record, there's no way that person's going to get a job. And then we outlaw them from having a gun because they're a convicted felon, and we're talking about enhancing the punishment for repeat offenders in those circumstances, when we know what can these people do. The unemployment rate for black in the city of Chicago is roughly 25%, according to one article here I looked up, and Latino community is like 12%, and white 7%. If we spend our money on prisons and incarcerating people instead of trying to help people, and we can't afford a CCC work program like we had back during Roosevelt's era.
Because we're wasting valuable federal dollars in the war on drugs, not only here domestically, but internationally. We have spent through the Merida Initiative under President Bush and former President Calderon, when they initiated the militarization of the war on drugs, in excess of $2 billion, and additional support that is going there. And the only thing that it's really produced is not a decrease in the amount of drugs coming into this country. It hasn't reduced the demand for drugs in this country. It's just wreaked havoc in Mexico. And because of the legalization of marijuana in certain states in this country, it's increased the amount of heroin that farmers who are forced to the drug trade in Mexico because of the big market in the U.S., getting involved in producing more heroin and then participating in the new market that's producing methamphetamine that comes to the U.S.
You know, I've been so interested in drug policy for so long. I ended up first working locally in Cook County, and then statewide, and then nationally giving speeches. And I've done Mexico City giving a speech with other quote-unquote drug experts. And I end up at the Commission on Narcotic Drugs, which is a United Nations commission. And they meet once a year, and they set the rules for the world, and they basically enforce the 1961 Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs that requires all nations of the world to outlaw and provide for the incarceration and deprivation of liberty of people who use drugs recreationally. And they put marijuana and they put heroin in the same Schedule 1. Absolutely foolish at the outset. We have people who are helped by medical marijuana. 28 states now have it. We have 8 states that have legalized marijuana outright for recreational purpose. Uruguay is the first country in the world to do it in defiance of the United Nations. We need our national leaders to demand drug policy reform and end these numerous crises that we're faced: guns, gangs, crime, prisons, the corruption of police, the use of excess force, the discriminatory application of law enforcement. I don't think there's a problem of magnitude in Chicago that isn't made worse by the war on drugs.
That's absolutely fact. And it's ironic that the failed war on drugs that we've embarked on and that we've pressured Mexico into and incentivized them by giving them millions of dollars has only contributed to Mexico's already bad level of corruption in the country. And it's introduced more money into the field of law enforcement and further corrupted a system that just wasn't working for the ordinary person. So it gives, ironically, it gives someone like a candidate Donald Trump this platform to come forth and to say, oh, I know how to stop the war on drugs. We'll just build a huge fence, spend $25 billion doing that, and all of a sudden, the flow of drugs is going to stop. That is so irrational. There's no evidence that that will happen, and it's just continuing down a wrong-headed direction that doesn't use common sense to get at the root causes of why we have so much violence on our streets in cities all over the country.
You mentioned President Trump, and the irony is if you go back like 15 years, I found a quote where he says that the only way to stop this drug problem is to legalize drugs. Now you jump forward, and politically, he can collect votes by selling drug war snake oil. And he's doing it now, talking about a wall. He's going to prevent drugs from coming into this country when the drug cartels use ultralights that can fly over this 2,000 mile wall. They can dig under it. If you look up the China wall, and you'll see that they've got caverns and compartments under the wall sufficient to house all of Peking.
And it's interesting because we've now introduced the specter of politics in the war on drugs. The initiation of the war on drugs, which was declared by Richard Nixon, was really an electoral strategy for him to get elected in 1968 by going after the hippies who were vilified as the cause of problems in our country, their opposition to the Vietnam War, and the African American community, where he went after organizers and leaders in the black community to also vilify them and criminalize them. And, it was a winning electoral strategy. And then once elected, he declared the war on drugs. And we've just continued, but it's been Republicans and Democrats complicit in this without taking a real rational look at what type of a policy we embarked on, that it's a total failure and it's been a waste of money and many lives have been ruined and lost in the process.
We had the quote from Halderman actually quoted on the screen last week where he says we're going to get the hippies, we're going to get the blacks, one's associated with marijuana, the other with heroin. We can vilify them, we can destroy their families, we can have nightly news about how horrible these people are. And then the vilifying of certain people, because they're Latin Americans or they're Muslims or there's some other frowned upon categorization. It's horrible.
Yeah, targeting certain minority groups within our society for political advantage.
I kind of, in preparation for the show tonight, I've been working with the idea that really people oftentimes think, well, drug legalization is just absolutely horrible and drug prohibition is designed to save the kids. And we kind of think of them at opposite ends of the continuum of possible drug policies. And the thought that occurred to me is exemplified here in this little drawing we'll put on our overhead. And that really prohibition is at one end of the possible drug policy continuum. And at the other end is not drug legalization. At the other end is a green light, just say okay to drugs. And no one says that. Instead of just say no or just say okay, there's a middle of the road, a middle ground, where we can use regulation, just as we've done with liquor, to decriminalize or legalize or tax or license and put other programs in place. What's wrong with prohibition and what's wrong with green light, I would suggest, is that both of them involve no regulation. When we prohibit drugs, we basically delegate the control over drugs to drug cartels and street gangs. They decide what will be sold, where it's going to be sold, how strong it's going to be, what it's going to be cut with. It's just unworkable, and we need to get into this middle ground of regulation and just say think instead of just say no.
Jim, I like your chart. I like the concept of where things lie in real life. And I think that we are evolving toward this middle ground where people understand the rationale that if we decriminalize, if we legalize, we can tax and we can license. In other words, we can take inventory. We have control over what occurs. And I'd also like to point out that I think this is one of the main reasons why so many young voters gravitated toward the campaign of Bernie Sanders, because they've been around, they've analyzed this, and they recognize that it is an archaic policy from the past that needs to be replaced because it's just wasting money and human lives and ruining people by incarcerating them for small offenses, violations, because we've made certain drugs illegal and we focus enforcement on mostly people who are poor and can't afford lawyers.
You know, we have tried to say on this program that there is no right or wrong answer on the war on drugs, and I have invited people from every end of the spectrum. I've invited politicians. I've invited Jack Riley, the former head of the DEA who went to D.C.,
Yes.
who retired as the number 2 man in the department. I've invited U.S. attorneys. I have tried to get someone to come on and say something in defense of the war on drugs. And you can't get them to, because it's absolutely indefensible. Frustrating when I'm trying to be open-minded and give people, we need a discussion. But people have been historically afraid to talk about these things, and they need to get over that.
But let me introduce a ray of hope.
Go ahead.
Today, in the 2 major dailies and other publications across Chicago, we read that State's Attorney Kim Foxx has announced that the State's Attorney will no longer be requesting bonds for people who are arrested and charged with low-level offenses. Most of them are related to possession of marijuana in Cook County. This will help us reduce the number of detainees at Cook County, and as importantly, if not more importantly, I think it will help us get on with a real conversation about drug policy, both at the local level, at the state level, and at the national level. So I believe that we're on the cusp of big changes that will occur across the country because of the people's willingness to step back and look at what we have been doing. A case in point that I don't think any one of us ever imagined was an experience in terms of a social issue that was deemed very, very controversial and one that would never change: marriage equality. And it's changed so dramatically across the country. No one sort of saw it coming, kind of like the Barack Obama candidacy in 2008. No one can really take credit for that. But I think that those are the types of changes that we will be experiencing over the next several years.
You know, tolerance and understanding is a winner. And making and crowning zero tolerance as some kind of a helpful program was just off kilter from the very start. I'm amazed that the war on drugs has lasted 40-some years as it has, when alcohol prohibition lasted 13 years and the people themselves threw it out because of the harms that it caused instead of the good that it did. Well,
And we have spent 2,000 times more last year than we spent in the first year of the war on drugs, and cannot show to this day that we've had an impact in terms of a reduction in the use of illicit drugs.
You know, it's, I think, indisputable that the war on drugs makes life in Chicago worse for many people, if not in taxes, jails, prisons, gangs, guns, shooting, overdose, you name the problem. But things are changing, and the reason it is because of people like you. I thank you so much
Thank you, Jim. It's a pleasure to join you.
for joining
Hope to be
us
back soon.
and Chicago's War on Drugs. My name is Jim Gierach. Good night.